Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Indian Council of World Affairs, I'd like to welcome you all to this book launch and discussion. The book is entitled India's Relations with the International Monetary Fund, 25 Years in Perspective, 1991 to 2016. It is written by Shri Srinivas, Additional Secretary, Department of Administrative Reforms and Public Grievances, Government of India, who was former advisor to the Executive Director, IMF India. And this book is the first comprehensive study on India's relations with the IMF and offers deep insights into an institution that has influenced the global economy in a significant way. We're very honored to welcome on this occasion our chief guest, the Honorable Governor of the Reserve Bank of India and the alternate Governor of the IMF, Shri Shaktikanta, Shri K.V. Eapen, Secretary, Department of Administrative Reforms and Public Grievances and former Senior Advisor to the Executive Director, IMF India, Dr. Anoop Singh, Member, 15th Finance Commission of India and former Director, Asia Pacific IMF, and Dr. Andreas Bauer, Senior Resident Representative, IMF, New Delhi. We'd like to begin with introductory remarks by Dr. T.C.A. Raghavan, Director General, Indian Council of World Affairs.
Good afternoon, Dr. Shaktikanta, Governor, Reserve Bank of India, distinguished panelists, Shri K.V. Eapen, Secretary, Department of Administrative Reforms and Public Grievances, Dr. Anoop Singh, Member, 15th Finance Commission, Dr. Andreas Bauer, Senior Resident Representative, IMF, Srimati Sukanya Balakrishnan, Shri Anil Suri, former DG ICWA, who had commissioned this book on the IMF and thereafter encouraged Shri Srinivas to complete it. Shri V. Srinivas, ladies and gentlemen, may I, on behalf of my colleagues, very warmly welcome you to the Indian Council of World Affairs. We are here to launch Srinivas's book on India's relations with the IMF, and also congratulate him on completing this very creative task he had undertaken. It is often commented that civil servants today are less engaged with creative pursuits and older traditions of research, writing and analysis are weakening. Work such as this, in fact, established the contrary position, and Srinivas is to be congratulated for the commitment and passion he brought to bear on this project. In the process, he has, and I'm happy to say this, also cemented his relationship with the Council. So apart from this work, he is also completing a very valuable study on India and the Asian Infrastructure Bank, which should also be out quite soon. There are many speakers to follow. I don't wish to take too much time, so I'll confine myself to three very brief points. Firstly, may I thank the Governor of the Reserve Bank for his presence here today. I'm sure this will spur many in the audience to think on the same lines as Srinivas of penning policy-oriented studies or even more academic works with a bearing on foreign policy and international relations. I would also like to thank all the distinguished panelists for their presence here today. Secondly, a word about our Council's publication program. We have a reasonably sized program of books which come out regularly, and you may wish to glance at some of the titles which are displayed outside. For those who are interested in studying a subject in depth, this provides a very good opportunity, and we are also translating many of these books into Hindi and other languages, and hope to see language editions of this particular volume on the IMF also out soon. Thirdly and finally, on a personal note, may I congratulate Shri Srinivas for his first book, and also very warmly congratulate Mrs. Srinivas and the family. Further, on a personal note, I would like to mention that Srinivas and I worked together first in the office of Mr. Jaswant Singh when he was External Affairs Minister and thereafter Finance Minister, and I personally am greatly honored to have Mrs. Jaswant Singh in the audience. Mr. Jaswant Singh played a very major role. He played a very major role in building up the Indian Council of World Affairs as a major foreign policy think tank of the country. And I do hope, Madam, you will convey to him our warmest respects and best wishes. Finally, congratulations again, Srinivas, for immersing yourself into the research required for this book while discharging heavy administrative responsibilities both in the Government of India and in the Government of Rajasthan. Thank you very much again for your presence here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Raghavan. Mr. V. Srinivas is an IAS officer of the 89 batch Rajasthan cadre. He's held important positions both in the centre and state. Presently, he is Additional Secretary in the Department of Administrative Reforms and Public Grievances. He was advisor to the Executive Director, IMF India, from 2003 to 2006, and he's a respected academician and a highly regarded institution builder. I'd now like to request Shri V. Srinivas to make a presentation on his book, India's Relations with the International Monetary Fund, 25 Years in Perspective, 91 to 2016.
Respected Shri Shaktikanta Dasji, Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, Dr. Anoop Singh, Member 15th Finance Commission, Shri K.V. Eapen, Secretary, Department of Administrative Reforms and Public Grievances, Mr. Andreas Bauer, Senior Resident Representative of the IMF India Office, Ambassador T.C.A. Raghavan, Director General, Indian Council of World Affairs, distinguished ambassadors, senior colleagues from the Indian Administrative Service, senior faculty of the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, the Assistant Secretaries of the 2017 batch, students of classes 11 and 12 of Modern School, ladies and gentlemen. Today is one of the most significant days of my life, and I am extremely grateful to each one of you for sharing this moment of personal achievement. I am personally grateful that Madam Jaswant Singh ji is here. I do remember in 2001, when the ICWA was brought under the Ministry of External Affairs, the first Sapru House lecture was delivered by Jaswant Singh Sahab from this very podium. And to address from this podium is a matter of great honor for me. The IMF represents the greatest institution that I have served in, a global institution without parallel, whose ideals of economic liberalism and democracy continue to inspire me. The IMF is the world's lender of last resort. Its approach, multilateral, multicultural, multi-ethnic, and above all, highly professional. The collective intellectual firepower of macroeconomists in the IMF carries is unmatched by any organization in the world. I am grateful to Shri Shaktikanta Dasji, Governor, Reserve Bank of India, and India's alternate governor to the IMF for his support in guiding me through this endeavor. Let me also extend my warm and hearty welcome to Shri K.V. Eapen, who had served as Senior Advisor in the ED's office, Dr. Anoop Singh ji, who served as Director in the IMF's Asia Pacific Department, Mr. Andreas Bauer, the IMF Senior Resident Representative to India. It's not an easy task for a serving civil servant to write a book. A subject of the complexity of India's relations with the International Monetary Fund required a lot of research work and interactions with a number of senior officials. I was encouraged to take up this task by Ambassador Nalin Suri, Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee, and Srimati Kalyani Shankar. I submitted my book research proposal following discussions with Ambassador T.C.A. Raghavan, who had always encouraged me to pursue academic excellence since I first served with him in the External Affairs Minister's office in 2001. Shortly thereafter, I was offered a fellowship by ICWA in 2017. Perhaps the first IAS officer to be awarded a book research fellowship from the Sapru House. I wish to acknowledge the support I received from Drs. Y.V. Reddy, Duvur Subbarao, C. Rangarajan, Bimal Jalan, M. Narasimham, Rakesh Mohan, Subir Gokarn, Kanagasabapati Kupuswamy, Nitin Desai, Deepak Nair, Shankaracharya, Ashok Lahiri, Arvind Virmani, Bhaskar Venkatramani, Partha Ray, and Krishnan Saranyan. I also wish to thank Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia and Dr. Rahul Kullar for guiding my research work. I worked in several libraries, the ICWA, the NIPFP, NMML, Parliament Library, National Library, and the IMF Library, going through thousands of documents of historical value and acknowledge the support of all librarians and support staff. In my years in Ajmer, my personal staff, Sri Satyamanu Singh and Naveen Antkar, helped me with various inputs. Let me take you through the brief highlights of the book. My book starts with a chapter on the International Monetary Fund, followed by a chapter on the major financial crises from Great Depression to the Great Recession. There are 3 India-specific chapters, an analytical view of the 1966 and 1981 IMF programs, the origins of the 1991 crisis, and the 1991 standby arrangement of the IMF with India. I have presented the IMF's Article 4 consultations with the Indian authorities from 1997 to 2016 and the evolutionary positions taken by India's governors and alternate governors at the IMFC meetings. The India-specific chapters are followed by chapters on my years with the IMF and interviews with the governors of RBI, the finance secretaries and the chief economic advisors, and the executive directors. As part of the roadmap forward, there are 2 chapters, G20, a decade of multilateralism, and a chapter on the rise of China in the international monetary system. India is an original member of the IMF. Exactly 75 years ago, in July 1944, India was represented at the Bretton Woods Conference by a 6-member delegation led by Sir Jeremy Reisman. There was a mercurial governor of the Reserve Bank of India, Sir Chintaman Deshmukh, and it also had a nominee from Tata's, Mr. A.D. Shroff. It was felt that India should lend its support to an institution which was identified and intended to put an end to the disastrous practices of competitive exchange rates and depreciation of currencies. India's quota was the 5th largest in 1945. My research findings are that the India-IMF relations are as much individual relations as they are institutional relations. The Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 witnessed a famous exchange between Sir John Maynard Keynes and Mr. A.D. Shroff. However, in the subsequent years, there was intellectual convergence of ideas between India's policymakers and the IMF's macroeconomists. And that was seen in the success of the 3 IMF programs of 1966, 81, and 91. Of these relationships, the Narasimham-Jacques de la Rose relationship stands out for sheer perseverance as they jointly ensured the fund approval for a $5 billion program in 1981. The Montek Singh Ahluwalia-Hubert Nice engagement helped push together radical reforms in 1991. I was witness to Dr. Y.V. Reddy's constructive engagement with Rodrigo Di Ratto and Anne Kruger, and subsequently the cordial interactions between Duvur Subbarao and Dominique Strauss-Kahn. The Christine Lagarde years have witnessed significant positive synergy with Indian authorities, and the Honorable Governor has had a number of constructive engagements with the former IMFC chairman, Augustin Carstens, who was invited for a recent C.D. Deshmukh lecture at the RBI. I have said that India is a poster child of the IMF. Each of India's 3 programs terminated earlier than projected. Post-program growth rates were higher than pre-program growth rates, and the repayments were always on schedule. Economic history will remember the flag bearers of India's economic reforms well. How does IMF history speak of the India's 91 program? The politics of borrowing from the IMF is always complex, but in India especially so. On the one hand, politicians had long viewed IMF conditionality with some disdain. As soon as it became known that government was applying for a standby arrangement, its leaders would be attacked in parliament and in the press for subjugating the interests to foreign domination. On the other hand, most countries' economic and financial officials had good relations with the IMF, and an unusually high degree of trust had developed between both sides over the years. The working relationship was unusual in that the authorities knew full well what they needed to do to qualify the fund's seal of approval and financial support. The decision to devalue, for example, was not made at the insistence of the fund, but on the understanding that the fund would approve it and that both sides believed that it was necessary and it was in India's interest. As had been true for the 1981 negotiations, the discussions were always amicable and collegial. In many ways, the IMF's program of 91-92 ensured India's integration into the global economy. From 2004 to 2008, the Indian economy witnessed strong momentum in investment, buoyant corporate profits, and high business confidence, along with a rise in productivity, surpassed only by China. Inflation was low, export growth was robust at 20%, and the country witnessed strong capital inflows adequate to finance the increased current account deficit. It was a period when the fund needed India more than India needed the fund. India became a creditor country in the IMF's financial transactions plan, which was a major step forward. I have highlighted the role of the IMF as the world's lender of last resort in formulating policies to enable crisis-ridden countries to regain macroeconomic stability. I've dealt with 9 major financial crises, and in my research, as with the IMF research, there were certain policy trilemmas that were thrown up. The incompatibility of capital flows with monetary policy autonomy and fixed exchange rate, the incompatibility between financial stability and capital mobility, and the interplay between fiscal policy, monetary policy, and capital mobility. The IMF in some ways became irrelevant in the mid-2000s, with several countries building reserves in the absence of any significant crisis, and faced severe criticism from leading economists and civil society that the IMF had outlived its mission, and the time for it has come to go into oblivion. The clarion call was, 50 years are long enough. Private capital flows had become larger. There was inadequate quota and voice for developing countries, resulting in imposition of stringent conditionality. Major issues and policies were not developed in the IMF, but in G7 meetings, with close to 1/2 of the voting power on the fund. The IMF did not have any major financing requests from members for crisis resolution. To ensure the fund's financing viability, the IMF board approved gold sales of 403 metric tons, 1/8 of the total holdings of gold. The gold sales program was completed by 2010 December, and India purchased 10 billion worth of IMF notes to enhance the fund's lending capacity. The 2008 Great Recession and global financial crises exposed the inconsistencies in fund surveillance, necessitating significant changes. This led to the rise of the G20 as the highest level of multilateral international cooperation. The advanced economies had to resort to unconventional monetary policies and quantitative easing and large-scale asset purchases to flood the system with liquidity. Following the 2008 global financial crisis, the IMF undertook several changes in its global economic governance model. There was a large gap between economic reality and quotas. There was dissatisfaction, and the global opinion could be reduced only if quotas were revised. And in January 2016, the United States had approved the revision of the IMF quotas, and the process was completed. After the revision, China became the 3rd largest member in the IMF, and India's quota rose to about 8th place. In the recent years, 2 developments stand out: the increased multilateralism within the G20 framework and the rise of China in the international monetary system, wielding an all-time high influence in international institutions. The future challenges for the fund governance have been flagged in my concluding chapter: even-handedness of fund surveillance, the fund's work on financial sector regulation, capital account management, and exchange rate management. On October 8, 2016, the Indian Finance Minister addressed the International Monetary and Financial Committee in Washington, D.C. during the Fund Bank annual meetings and presented India as the fastest-growing major economy globally. GDP growth was 7.2%, foreign exchange reserves were at an all-time high of 372 billion, current account deficit was 1.1%, and inflation was 5.05%. The economic transformation from an IMF program country to the world's fastest-growing major economy in a period of 25 years represents a significant success story for India-IMF relations. My long-held view is that the IMF remains very relevant to India. The IMF is an institution of high credibility whose voice is heard and heeded across the world. Today, India is a moderately open economy. In another 5 years, we will be more open. And India's financial systems integrate with the global economy. India's economic prospects will depend on global growth and global welfare more than ever before. To conclude, once again, I'm extremely grateful to the Governor RBI, Shri K.V. Eapen, Shri Anoop Singh, and Dr. Andreas Bauer for accepting my invitation. I'm grateful to Ambassador T.C.A. Raghavan and the entire team of ICWA officials who have supported me throughout the past 2 years. I'm grateful to my family for their continued support. I'd also like to thank each and everyone in the audience on this special occasion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Srinivas. I'd now like to request our chief guest, the Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, to please formally release the book. Shri Shaktikanta Das is the 25th Governor, Reserve Bank of India, and alternate Governor, International Monetary Fund, an IAS officer of the Tamil Nadu cadre. He retired as Secretary, Department of Revenue and Department of Economic Affairs in the Ministry of Finance, and thereafter was also acting member of the 15th Finance Commission and G20 Sherpa of India. During his tenure, spanning almost 4 decades, Shri Das has held important positions in the centre and state in the areas of finance, taxation, industries and infrastructure, just to name a few. During his tenure in the Finance Ministry, he was directly associated with the preparation of as many as 8 union budgets and served as the alternate governor in the World Bank, ADB, NDB and AIIB. I'd now like to invite Shri Shaktikanta Das, Governor, Reserve Bank of India, to please address the gathering.
My dear friend and younger colleague for so many years, Shri Srinivas, other dignitaries on the dais, ladies and gentlemen, I'm extremely happy to be attending this event here, and it's nice to see so many known faces, so many senior colleagues in the service when we were in the service. So it's indeed an honor for me to sort of be here and to release the book. I must in fact thank Srinivas for inviting me to be here, and I must mention that we had quite a bit of interaction during, post my retirement, and also when I was in the Finance Commission. A lot of interaction we had about the book, and I saw a certain kind of dedication and commitment in Srinivas. So I really want to thank you, Srinivas, for inviting me to release this book. I am delighted to be part of this event for the launch of Srinivas's book on India's relations with the International Monetary Fund. A respected civil servant of 1989 batch, he has drawn extensively on his hands-on stint as advisor to the Executive Director of India at the IMF during 2003-2006, combining it with his scholarship and experience in policy making in the government. The book and the function today will promote readership on an important subject and spur more thoughts and analysis. As you are all aware, RBI as an institution is closely involved with the functioning of the IMF, both to project India's macroeconomic interests as well as from the angle of the governance of IMF. Against the backdrop of previous fund programs with India in 1966 and 1981, the book trains its focus on perhaps the most eventful period of India's engagement with the fund. beginning with balance of payments crisis of 1991 and converging the period up to 2016 that brings to fore the dramatic transition in India's status with IMF from a debtor to a creditor. In the same period, the Indian economy also witnessed a transformation from an inward-looking economy driven by import substitution to an increasingly open and emerging global power in a dynamic world order. I think this aspect Srinivas has already highlighted in his presentation. This period also witnessed the transformation of the fund from a stigmatized lender of last resort, focused exclusively on exchange rate surveillance, towards a more central role in the international monetary system, especially after the global financial crisis of 2008. Over this period, the fund has not only focused on macroeconomic policies, but embraced a wider gamut of issues that covered women's empowerment, poverty alleviation, sustainable development, fintech, and climate change. As Dr. Y.V. Reddy has stated in his foreword to the book, and it's really good that Srinivas could get a foreword from Dr. Reddy because he has spent so many years in government and the Reserve Bank. So obviously he has a very clear and deep understanding of India's relations with IMF. So Dr. Reddy says in his foreword to the book fills a serious gap in the existing literature on the subject, and I can't agree with him more. I congratulate Srinivas for his scholarly contribution in writing this book. I thought I would take this opportunity to share some of my own thoughts on the fund and its role in the international monetary system. Drawing from my experience, including as G20 Sherpa and now as alternate to the finance minister in the board of governors of the fund. Speaking on the sidelines of the Fund Bank spring meeting in April this year, I had alluded to labels such as currency manipulation and call for greater understanding all around to the compulsions of emerging market economies, EMEs, in building up their own buffers. I would like to point out that the origin of the phrase currency manipulation is of recent vintage, dating to 2015, when the US Treasury started publishing a semi-annual report on the subject. In this backdrop, it has acquired a predominantly bilateral connotation. Currently, the semi-annual report judges countries as currency manipulators on the basis of 3 criteria. 1, a bilateral trade surplus with the United States of at least $20 billion. Second, a material current account surplus of at least 2% of GDP. And third, persistent one-sided net purchases in 6 out of 12 months, adding to at least 2% of an economy's GDP over a 12-month period. A country is put on the monitoring list even if 2 of the 3 criteria are met. India was recently removed from that list after featuring in it from 2018. In the more recent period, the term has gained greater focus in the context of the current heat and dust of trade wars. A question that crops up is why has labeling become a bilateral prerogative when multilateral institutional architecture exists for the purpose? After all, Article 4, Section 3A of the Articles of Agreement of the IMF invests it with the oversight of international monetary system. Article 4, Section 1.3 enjoins each member country to avoid manipulating exchange rates to gain unfair competitive advantage. Further, there are other articles which obligate members and their fiscal agents not to engage in discriminatory currency arrangements or multiple currency practices, MCPs, unless they are approved by the fund or maintained under Article 14, Section 2.3. The application of the multiple currency practices, MCP concept, has been reasonably considered, explained and applied by the fund with suitable changes carried out whenever required. After the collapse of the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates and eventual floating of currencies from 1973, The second amendment of the fund's Article of Agreement in 1978 made its mandate more explicit by fixing its oversight over individual countries' exchange rate policies. The fund's mandate was updated in 2007 to clarify that exchange rate manipulation was associated with fundamental misalignment that results in external instability. Fears of labeling among the membership led to several reviews, culminating in 2012 when an integrated surveillance decision was adopted which emphasized the connection between domestic and external stability as well as global risks. In pursuit of this mandate, the fund in its Article 4 consultations every year undertakes in-depth assessment of members' economic developments and policies, including and especially exchange rate policies. This is backed by rigorous technical evaluation through a suite of models. The consultation report is published, and any case of exchange rate misalignment and or multiple currency practices is candidly brought to the notice of national authorities for correction. This is mandatory as the articles of agreement constitute an international treaty. And you will, most of you would be aware that in India, these provisions are underpinned by the parliamentary legislation in the form of the International Monetary Fund and Bank Act 1945. Given this multilateral framework, the overlay of bilateral labeling that I talked about earlier, that is, I referred to currency manipulation, which is essentially a bilateral labeling. Now, given this kind of a multilateral framework, I think this raises questions about the existence of bilateral labeling as well as on the role of the fund itself. Admittedly, like any policy-making institution, the fund's policies and practices will not always be the right or the best in terms of efficacy. As its own independent evaluation office, IEO, pointed out in 2005, a major reason for the fund failing to meet its core responsibility of exchange rate surveillance was a strong sense among some member countries of a lack of even-handedness in surveillance, that somehow it was tolerant of currency depreciations but not of countries resisting appreciation. This criticism by the IEO of IMF persists in its evaluation update of 2017. Notwithstanding such criticisms, the IMF is seen to be open to learning and deservedly remains a well-respected institution. We therefore look forward to engaging with the fund on its April 2019 proposal. In the last spring meeting, this proposal was placed. So we look forward to engaging with the IMF on its April 2019 proposal for a more integrated framework encompassing the interaction of monetary, exchange rate, macroprudential and capital flow management policies. I strongly believe that a multilateral framework under the aegis of the IMF is the most appropriate approach to deal with issues of currency management, exchange rate management. It is important to appreciate the context in which emerging market economies operate so as to foster a shared understanding of their challenges. First, the nature of shocks which these countries face has changed from balance of payments strains to full-blown financial crisis. Second, in the years following the global financial crisis, EMEs and financial markets have been buffeted by global spillovers, which have amplified both sudden surges and sudden stops or reversal of capital flows. The existing state of financial safety nets, regional or multilateral, fall grossly short of providing necessary buffers against such turbulence. Moreover, access to swaps from systemically important central banks is not always available to the emerging market economies. For many EMEs, high fluctuations in currency movements have pronounced macroeconomic consequences. This is corroborated in a recently articulated view by Mark Carney, the Governor of Bank of England, that significant improvements in institutional frameworks of EMEs are being offset by asymmetries in international monetary system and market-driven finance. Against this backdrop, these countries have accumulated reserves over the past 2 decades, which has significantly reduced the sensitivity of capital flows to push factors. Governor Carney adds that this extra insurance, however, has come at a high cost for the EMEs. In this context, I may mention that in spite of the insurance coming at a high cost, there is enough evidence to indicate that the costs of financial crisis have been very high in relation to the costs of such insurance. Thus, it is evident that build-up of reserves by the EMEs so far is not so much to prop up their currencies as to self-insure themselves against global contagion. Now, how do we collectively ensure that multilateral principles and frameworks for orderly exchange rate and payment arrangements are not superseded by bilateral hegemony? The best way forward is to strengthen existing institutions like the IMF and make them more relevant and trusted. Through its articles of agreement, the fund is a quota-based organization, but quotas currently constitute only 49% of its resources. At the height of the global financial crisis, as you would be aware, the IMF came out with several bilateral arrangements like the note purchase agreement or the new arrangements to borrow, and India was a contributor to both these arrangements. These borrowing arrangements, however, are intended to be temporary. The solution lies in commitments of quota resources by members in order to secure legitimacy of the fund as a global lender of last resort, the overseer of international monetary system and trusted policy advisor. This adds urgency to the completion of the 15th General Review of Quotas, which is delayed for the 4th year now. The global order today faces several challenges that will test the skills of international organizations as well as those of national monetary and fiscal authorities. International coordination has become somewhat weaker in very recent years. Many advanced economies have been pursuing low interest rate policies for long without perhaps adequate recognition of their adverse impacts. Today, at the global level, the total amount of bonds with negative yields has risen to nearly 13 trillion US dollars, implying that nearly a third of advanced economy government bonds trade at negative yields. Equity premium has crossed 4%, which is one standard deviation higher than its long-term average. Return to lower interest rates in advanced economies poses challenges as leverage has already built up in the EMEs and the needed deleveraging is not complete in many of the European economies. Amid low global interest rates, total credit to the non-financial sector in the EMEs went up from 107.2% of GDP at the end of 2008 to 194.4% of GDP by March 18, before it dropped to 183% at the end of 2018. Net private capital flows to EMAs in the form of direct and portfolio investments also nearly doubled in the post-crisis period. This has posed risks to some EMAs. Some of these risks have surfaced in the form of weak bank, non-bank balance sheets in many of the emerging economies and other economies, and some remain latent and can surface, especially when the global interest rate cycles turn decisively. The world will be looking to the IMF to suggest dependable solutions. EMEs on their part need to follow policies that promote macroeconomic and financial stability while focusing on growth. Solutions are turning to be more difficult to come by as the global economy seems to be moving into a new and unsettling phase in an environment of stressed trade negotiations, rising geopolitical confrontation, and limited policy space and high debt levels in several economies. General government debt of advanced economies as a group has surpassed 100% of GDP. Fiscal space is also constrained in many of the advanced economies. It is important in the backdrop of slowing global growth that policies of monetary and fiscal authorities are well calibrated so that they support growth without further build-up of leverage and asset price bubbles. Prudent policies are critical to growth with macroeconomic stability. Globally, we need to focus on policy space, judiciously use it, and simultaneously undertake structural reforms to undertake productivity, innovation, and job creation. The coming year will test IMF for its policy advice on these areas. How the IMF and the central banks provide forward guidance will be the key to sustaining global economic growth while maintaining financial stability. I have highlighted a few concerns that have caused me to introspect considerably on the future of global monetary and financial system, especially as we confront these challenges on a day-to-day basis in various central banks and in Reserve Bank of India. A global search for effective solutions is underway. This quest must be armed with lessons of history and experience. And in this context, I commend the book written by my young friend Srinivas for your reading. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Shri K.V. Eapen is an IAS officer of the 84 batch from the Assam Meghalaya cadre. He is currently Secretary, the Department of Administrative Reforms and Public Grievances, and also Secretary, Department of Pensions. During his long tenure in this service, he has held several important positions and was also former advisor to the Executive Director, IMF. I'd now like to request Shri K.V. Eapen to please address the gathering.
Shri Shaktikanta, Governor, Reserve Bank of India, Dr. Anoop Singh, Member of the 15th Finance Commission, Dr. Andreas Bauer, Senior Resident Representative of the International Monetary Fund in Delhi, Shri T.C.A. Raghavan from the ICWA, my colleague V. Srinivas, Additional Secretary in the Department of Administrative Reforms and Public Grievances, distinguished invitees, ladies and gentlemen. Let me at the outset thank the Indian Council of World Affairs as well as Shri V. Srinivas for inviting me to be a panelist on this occasion. As you've been told, Srinivas and I are both in the Department of Administrative Reforms and Public Grievances as Additional Secretary and Secretary respectively, and coincidentally both of us have worked in the International Monetary Fund, Srinivas as advisor and me as a senior advisor to the Executive Director of the Indian Chair, though at very different periods of time. Perhaps the government has felt that our experiences of quota and governance reform at the IMF would come in handy while dealing with the administrative reforms within the Government of India. Or more likely perhaps the grievances with the developed countries often articulated by the developing countries in interactions on the board of the IMF may have made us more sympathetic in handling the public grievances that we deal with in our everyday work in this department. My intervention today will be on IMF financing and governance issues rather than on the monetary and financial sector issues, which the Honorable Governor has already dealt with elaborately, and I'm sure that Dr. Anoop Singh and Dr. Bauer will perhaps outline greater in detail. Let me first compliment Srinivas for bringing out this book. It's a timely, well-written, and almost racy accounts in parts of the complex relationship between an important international institution like the IMF and a large country like India. As you have heard, the relationship has been an evolving one. Currently, India is a creditor country, but has earlier been a debtor and a recipient of program assistance. As one of the original members of the IMF when it was set up in 1944, and also as one of 5 members who were nominated and not elected to the board, with the 5th largest share in quota, India was in a unique position of being a member of the IMF and its board even before it was an independent country. Indeed, it is to the credit of the founding members that this was done. And as you've heard, the position of India has changed within the board, and now it is an elected member with the 8th position in terms of quota share. Though the title of the book mentions the period 1991 to 2016, Srinivas is not bound by mundane considerations of time. The book begins with an overview of the global role of the IMF and the broad contours of India's relationship with it over the last 75 years. The second chapter has a useful summary of various global economic crises, covering the period from the Great Depression before even perhaps John Maynard Keynes and Harry Drexler had visualized the IMF. For me, personally, the description of the IMF's role in the European crisis in 2010 was of particular interest, as I was at that time in the IMF. The standby arrangements of loans from the IMF during the European crisis were unprecedented in the history of such arrangements in terms of sheer size. As mentioned by Srinivas in the book, the Greece SBA, the standby arrangement program in 2010 was 28 billion euros, which was later supplemented by an additional program in 2012 of another 30 billion euros. Similarly, Ireland required an IMF program of 22.5 billion euros and Portugal 26 billion. Obviously, such huge amounts of loans and assistance could not be met by the then level of quota-based IMF resources, and that is why the period, particularly from 2008, saw a shift in the source of resources for financing, something that the Honorable Governor had already mentioned in his speech. The quota shares of members were not as important as the other special arrangements that the IMF entered into. For example, there were the so-called new arrangements to borrow, which raised money from the better-off membership. The irony in terming the raising of additional resources from the membership by the acronym NAB for the new arrangements to borrow was perhaps not lost on anyone. Further delay in the process of formal approval by the USA of the 2010 quota reforms, which was to double the quota resources, also forced the IMF to enter into such arrangements as the funds available were not sufficient to meet the requirements for Europe at that time. However, it should be noted that the increase in quota share amounts would have had only a marginal impact, as the borrowings in Europe exceeded 100 to 150% of the quota. The note purchase agreements that the fund entered into, along with the NAB, were major sources of financing for the European programs, and it was again rather ironical that money from emerging economy members like India went to bail out some of the most developed parts of the world. These fundamental changes in the source of financing and its implications on a quota-based organization like the IMF have not been analyzed in the book, though it has been mentioned as a concern in the IMFC deliberations in a paragraph on page 112 in chapter 7. There are obvious implications for the management and role of the fund and on its forward commitment capacity should there be another global or regional financial crisis. Given the present economic problems, the analysis would have been enhanced by a thematic discussion of a few such important issues. There are 3 very interesting chapters in the book which have a detailed description of the 1966, 1981 and 1991 assistance programs that India availed from the IMF. Here too, Srinivas goes to time periods before his start date. For many of us, the 1991 program would perhaps be the one to remember, as it coincided with the fundamental changes that have taken place in the Indian economy. The issue as to whether the reforms in India were initiated by the onset of the crisis and the resulting performance criteria in the IMF program, or whether it was something that had been initiated even prior to the program as part of an overall reform process is still debated, as mentioned in the book. In fact, the relationship between India and IMF during the three programs of 1966, 1981 and 1991 was very different. Srinivas has in a pithy observation in chapter 3 pointed out that in 1981, India did not go to the fund on a stretcher like it did in 1966. In 1981, it was like walking into a clinic for a checkup. However, the 1991 program was interesting because it was a case where the two institutions, the IMF on the one hand and the Government of India and the Reserve Bank of India on the other, knew exactly what was to be done. In a sense, to extend Srinivas's simile, I would say it was like a case of two physicians, of which one was sick but knew exactly what was to be done. However, formal consultation with the other physician was mandatory before treatment could begin. Thus, India's relationship with the IMF has always been friendly, and though a recipient of program assistance on three different occasions, she never had to go through the strict performance criteria or the kind of structural adjustments that were the hallmark of previous IMF programs, which created so much of antipathy across the world. To use the fund's terminology, a sort of stigma was associated with IMF assistance. An interesting innovation in this book is the way that Srinivas has incorporated in the personal reminiscences and comments of major players like Dr. C. Rangarajan, Dr. R.N. Malhotra, Dr. Monteg Singh Ahluwalia, Dr. Y.V. Reddy, Dr. D. Subba Rao, former finance secretaries like Shri Shaktikanta, as well as former executive directors and advisors, to provide a more personal and intimate account of the burning issues that they had to deal with. Chapter 9 contains observations of all these major figures. There is the account of a former senior advisor to the Indian ED that our distinguished fellow panelist Dr. Anoop Singh had a very difficult time while dealing with the Argentina program as the director of the Western Hemisphere Department. While all this makes for very interesting reading and is also an eye-opener in some ways, perhaps some of the themes mentioned therein could merit detailed further exploration. One of them is what the IMF's own internal evaluation organization has termed mission creep among the staff, which is an excessive loyalty to the program and conditionalities and not enough appreciation of recipient country priorities and views. However, I will flag just a few that would find resonance in this gathering held in the ICWA as they pertain to the system of governance in international organizations and have implications for the future. As I have broadly indicated earlier, at the center of the power structure in the IMF is the quota share that a member has. The quota reform for the 14th review of quotas took a good 5 years, from 2010 to 2015, and at the end of which India is only in the 8th position in the board. There has been no functional, fundamental change in the governance of IMF, which is dominated by the Europeans and Americans. Even after the reforms, the US continues to have 16.66% of the quota, and the major European countries, Germany, France, Italy, and at least for the present, in terms of the EU, the United Kingdom, together have 16.56%. Any share above 15% allows veto powers, which allows for more actual effective decision-making in the executive board. The BRICS countries together only have around 14%. The governance of the IMF, to an extent, is reflective of the earlier European and American view of the world, though some adjustments have been made with China's rise by giving it the third largest quota share. Though share of quotas is important for effective decision-making in the board, as I have pointed out, actual amount of quotas will not be sufficient to meet the resource requirement that the IMF will need at its disposal to effectively treat major countries in crisis. It may be sufficient for smaller countries, but will not be enough for others. Not surprisingly, many countries have entered into regional financing arrangements or into contingency reserve arrangements or arrangements between central banks as a cornerstone of the policy going ahead. This would have important implications for the future, as the role of the IMF in safeguarding the international functional financial architecture would change. Dr. Subir Gokarn, our current ED, has been quoted in the book that in the years between 2020 and 2030, the fund's relationship with India would not be very different. India may get more quota share, and the share of BRICS countries together may exceed 15%. He points out that we have been too individualistic in our views and need to place far more emphasis on collective activity. Within the BRICS, however, China is striking a very independent path. It has got the 4th Deputy Managing Director's position in the fund, and it carries a lot of weight in the management of the fund. The 15th quota review, which has already been postponed, is thus quite unlikely to result in a substantial increase in quota or any fundamental change in structure. Another element of governance reform is the reform of the functioning of the IMF board. The managing director of the IMF has been a European right from its very beginning, and the first deputy managing director position is generally occupied by a US national. The present domination of Europeans in the number of executive director positions continues even after the reduction of representation of 2 advanced European chairs, as it has only been shifted to emerging European economies, some of whom are EU members or may become so in due course. It is therefore not surprising, as I mentioned, that alternate financing arrangements and central bank to central bank agreements for financing, which are more flexible and easier to implement, have come up across the world. The abiding question for the future, therefore, is whether the IMF as an organization should be viewed less in its financing role and more as a research, advisory, and capacity-building organization, alerting the world about impending economic and financial crisis, and as a trusted independent advisor to countries. In fact, the IMF's spillover reports for the G20, its multilateral surveillance reviews, its bilateral Article 4 consultations, as well as the World Economic Outlook and GFSR are now its major flagship activities. The IMF has also had to reform to recapture its role as a trusted advisor. Till the early 2000s, every fund bank meeting was characterized by huge demonstrations by non-government organizations around Pennsylvania Avenue in downtown Washington, D.C. Over time, these demonstrations have almost come to an end, as the IMF's financing role and its views on conditionalities have changed. Nothing is more instructive in this regard than the IMF's increased flexible position on capital management measures. Similarly, Ms. Christine Lagarde, as MD, has emphasized issues relating to environment, gender, income inequality, poverty and safety nets much more than any other MD previously. The types of financing arrangements have also changed a lot, with more emphasis on contingency and flexibility in the credit lines. These themes have to be explored by researchers in more detail. I would like to congratulate Srinivas for this excellent book. The last word in this area is perhaps yet to be written, but this is definitely a very good beginning. In future explorations, he could perhaps look at the approach of James Boughton, who is the official historian of the fund. The 2 books written by him covering the period 1979-1989 and 1990 to 1999, called Silent Revolution and Tearing Down Walls, are exemplary in the way that they have treated IMF's relationship with members, thoroughly analyzing each theme of that relationship element. However, Srinivas definitely deserves to be complimented for this great effort, and we look forward to the next edition or even another book which deals with specific issues in an intense and detailed manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Anoop Singh is an adjunct professor at the Georgetown University, Washington, D.C. He serves as member of the 15th Finance Commission of India. He's been director of the Asia Pacific Department of the IMF since November 2008, and before that, he was director of the Western Hemisphere Department. He's also held other important positions at the IMF and has several publications to his credit. Please welcome Dr. Anoop Singh, member, 15th Finance Commission of India.
All right, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Let me first start off by saying I thank Dr. Raghavan. The council was established before the IMF. I take it. So it's good we're here. Let me thank Mr. Srinivas. I think he's written, as we've heard before, the only such book that exists. So I think that is exemplary, and it shows up. We have a full house. And we have the Governor of the Reserve Bank of India. All I will say is this is not good enough. Your next book launch will be in Washington. And soon. Okay. I'm not quite sure what I should do now, but let me talk more about the IMF than about India. The two are obviously very well connected. No one has mentioned this point, but I think the timing of what Srinivas has done is also very important. It is, yes. Can you hear me all right? Okay. It is, I think, exactly 75 years last week, or 2 weeks ago, since the Bretton Woods Conference, where the IMF was basically conceptually established. Bretton Woods is a wonderful little place up in New Hampshire. Now, why do I bring up the Bretton Woods Conference? Well, let's look at where the IMF is and where it should be. But before we get into all that, let's remind ourselves of what Keynes had in mind as early as the 1930s, well before the Bretton Woods Conference, of what an institution like the IMF should be. And Keynes wrote this in the early 1930s. The ideal system would surely be in the foundation of a supranational bank that would have similar relations with the national central banks to those that exist between each central bank, such as the Reserve Bank of India, and its subordinate banks. That's what Keynes had in mind in the early 1930s, and as the governor has said, this has kind of been the focus all these years. It's been a lot of years since 1944. The problem is the world has changed, and as my colleagues have stated, the IMF may not have changed enough. And let me talk briefly on those 2 points. Why has the world changed? This kind of builds on what the governor just said. As we know, exemplified by 2008, but not only by 2008, the risks to global liquidity have compounded with the explosive rise of financial globalization that was completely unforeseen in 1944. Financial globalization reflects the cross-border operations of banks and other financial institutions that have sharply raised what I call asset price correlations across all major asset classes with potential contagion effects. The result is we have today risks from liquidity that were not even known about in 1944. They are testing the international policy framework today to see if it can monitor the volatility of global liquidity and to identify risks before they affect financial stability. A number of these issues have been raised by Srinivas in his last chapters on financial stability. But basically, in the last 10 years, evidence has been building of the higher volatility of financial markets given the changing nature of financial globalization. It's not just financial globalization, it's the changing nature of it, which means the potential reduction in liquidity available from banks because we have the rise of multiple players with liquidity mismatches and counterparty risks. As the governor has just said, we have witnessed several what I call flash events in the last 10 years since the global financial crisis. There is rising concern among many researchers and policymakers that such spikes in volatility and sudden shifts in liquidity have become more common. At the same time, we are also seeing, as my colleagues have just said, a rising share of emerging markets in the global financial system. Over the next decade, emerging economies, especially from Asia, will account for probably more than a half of global financial assets, with a number of systemically important banks coming from Asia, which is precisely where financial integration has been rising rapidly. These factors, therefore, have multiple effects on global liquidity. Rising risks from the financial integration of emerging markets, and therefore all this raises the urgency of dealing with the shifts that could take place in what I call global liquidity. There are other factors that make this even more important, especially that across the world, in many advanced countries, and frankly also in emerging markets, we are seeing debt buildups. When you have debt buildups, as we see across the world, they could spark a sudden repricing of market risks and pressures on liquidity. It's worrying that the macroeconomic buffers, public buffers, to deal with such potential pressures on liquidity and their contagion are probably now much more limited than 10 years ago, for political reasons as well as for those of crisis legacy areas. Therefore, to my mind, where we are today compared to what Keynes said in the early 1930s is that what is at stake, in my view, is how the international governance framework monitors, regulates and manages the complex drivers of global liquidity. And I would say global liquidity should be regarded as a public good, given that its excessive volatility can immediately and radically affect the international financial system. So the issue therefore comes back to what the governor said. Do we then need to transform the IMF to become more of a global monetary institution to manage global liquidity and protect financial stability? I make these points for a number of reasons, in part because of the last 5 years before I came to India and the Finance Commission, I've been working closely with no other than Michel Camdessou, and we have tried to write up what needs to be done. Let me briefly tell you what the IMF needs to be to become more of a supranational national bank compared to where it has been. And I'll be short. Number one, it is surveillance. To move in this direction, the IMF needs to broaden the reach and the instruments of surveillance consistent with financial globalization. As we know, the IMF has had responsibility legally and formally over current account balances. The IMF needs to be assigned similar, identical monitoring responsibility over movements in capital account balances. This is critical to manage the current account imbalances, because very often their outcomes can diverge from fundamentals because of the globalization of capital markets. Number two, more work is needed across the world, including in the IMF, on the cross-border assets and liabilities of these multiple players that affect global liquidity, in order to really gauge global financial interlinkages and the potential spillovers that could affect global liquidity. For example, what some have thought is that the IMF could now set up a high-level group charged with assessing these linkages and overseeing global liquidity. That is not yet being done on a daily basis at a high level. Finally, there is the issue of what makes an institution a global central bank. This brings us to the issue of the special drawing rights and the SDR. Indeed, if the IMF is the institution that is going to manage global liquidity, it will need more instruments to act as a lender of last resort. When I say lender of last resort, I don't mean manager of individual crises. I talk about managing global systemic changes to liquidity. It's worth noting that relative to the size of the global economy, and especially to capital markets, today the IMF is smaller than it was in 1945. And therefore the issue is, how can the IMF have the ability to create reserves with a latitude necessary to manage global liquidity? The principle was created with the SDR, but the instrument has stopped there. How can it be overhauled in order to fulfill the role that was originally envisaged? When they created the SDR, it was envisaged at that time that it will be the regulatory instrument that the institution will need to manage global liquidity. So, those are my thoughts. It's more to say the world has come a long way. Number two, today it is financial globalization and the role of capital markets that is the importance of the day. And finally, I'm sure the governor will agree, we need an institution that acts as a global central bank. If not, if there are crises, like in 2008, the US Fed gave swap assets to just a group of countries that had high levels of dollar trading in order to manage shifts in liquidity. India was not part of that group, which is why I do believe we need, not we, the world needs a global central bank. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anoop Singh. Dr. Andreas Bauer is IMF's long-standing representative in India. He served in the IMF for over 15 years in various departments. He has vast experience in serving with countries in the Asia-Pacific region, having served in the Asia-Pacific department. And today is Dr. Bauer's last day in India as he returns to resume his duties at the IMF headquarters as mission chief for Korea. So please welcome Dr. Andreas Bauer.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, of course, a pleasure and privilege to be today with you. And of course, first of all, I would like to congratulate Srinivas for this book. Shortly after I arrived in India, actually, Srinivas came to see me with the book project. It was a set of notes, and we discussed the book. And then I didn't really hear much about it until one day I came to my office and there was this nicely edited and bound book in front of me. So he had done it all in fast time and with much determination. And the determination, I lived it myself again when he called me and said that we would have a book launch on July 26 and that he wanted me to join. And I said, look, I would love to join, but you know, this is the day when I'm actually leaving. I'm going to go on a plane. And then he said, well, but at what time does your plane leave? So it's leaving in the evening. Oh, no problem. The issue is that the event is at 3 o'clock, so we can do that easily, and then afterwards you can leave. So he is somebody who is really, once he has a project in front of him, you know, he gets it done. So congratulations to you, and congratulations also to the government of India and to India to have such a determined civil servant in its ranks who can actually not just do a normal job, but also in addition to that write a book. As Anoop Singh just said, of course, it's also the timing of this launch is exquisite on the 75th birthday of the Bretton Woods conference in which the IMF was launched. And of course, one thing that wasn't mentioned yet is that India was a founding member of that conference, and it's described in the book. It shows in some of the quotes there that really the Indian delegation was very actively involved in the creation of the Bretton Woods institution, and as somebody said, it was really punching above its weight, because remember, at the time India wasn't even independent, but it was there already shaping the institutions of the future. I think this book does at least three very nice things. So the first one is that it actually explains in very accessible language what the IMF does, and in my experience, it's actually not well known in my interactions that I have with the public here in my function in India and elsewhere, that the public kind of, yeah, we heard about the IMF, but exactly what you do is not really clear. There's the World Bank also around, and I think the book does a very nice job to explain that, and in a language I think that not just the distinguished guests here and the ones that have a long history in public policies can read, but also I see a younger generation sitting there. I think even for you, you can pick up that book and you can learn a bit about global governance and international economic issues. So that I think is one big contribution, the what that the IMF does. But it doesn't end here. I think Srinivas also opens a window as to how we do it. And that is always a bit more difficult, because this is about the operation, this is the internals. And there I think his personal account of his time in the fund, and also the testimonies of many Indian officials who have been there are quite interesting read, and then they give you a glimpse of how the fund operates, and how we try to perform our duties. And then the third, I think, major contribution of this book is also to chronicle the engagement with India. And it's been mentioned by some of the previous speakers, and I think the key insight there, even for me it was interesting, it's the IMF in India is not just the 1991 reforms and the program. So there was history before that, and there's been also a lot of history after that, and I think it's very nice for Srinivas to kind of put that out there and put this in the public domain. I think, so stimulated by going through the book, I would just like to share kind of two reflections today that kind of complement the more forward-looking section of the book that looks in the future. And the first one is I'd like to think a little bit about the role of multilateralism in the time ahead, and with that also the role of the IMF. And the second thing, of course, I would like to discuss a little bit is the relationship of the IMF and India, and how we can make that relationship most beneficial for both the institution and also for India, of course. So in terms of multilateralism, the founders of the IMF recognized the importance of cooperation, of international cooperation for a successful global economic order. And they were, of course, influenced in that belief that they established that belief that inward-oriented policies had led really to the economic and then also the catastrophe of the Second World War early in the 20th century, in the first half of the 20th century. And so the vision was really that countries cannot just look at their own benefit, but they have to cooperate to create a successful international economic order that can create prosperity. And if you look back today, 75 years, we can see that this vision was really widely successful. Almost everywhere in the world today, people live better and longer lives. If you look at incomes per capita, they have quintupled since 1945. If you look at people that have come out of poverty, more than 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty in the time since this Bretton Woods conference took place, and since the nations of the world decided that they wanted to cooperate on economic issues. And that, of course, has been I think one of the big successes to which, of course, the IMF and many others also contributed. But today, of course, multilateralism and globalization, they're facing some challenges, and I think you all follow the newspapers. We see, of course, tension that is arising on economic issues, and there are a number of causes for that. In the first place, of course, is that this world has become much more multipolar today. We have emerging market economies that are becoming larger in the sense that their economies now produce much more than it did before. There's not just one large economy or two on top, but many more economies are catching up. That's of course a good thing in terms of the distribution of incomes around the world, but it also makes cooperation much harder. So multilateralism in a world that is multipolar is of course much more difficult than if you have a more unipolar system, and that's a challenge. The other challenge that was already mentioned here also is the issue of rising inequality within countries. So there's also, and with that coupled, a rising uncertainty. If we look forward with new technologies that seem to disrupt quite a way, how economies have functioned for some time. And that has created pressures for inward-looking policies, and we've seen them in the trade wars and the kind of the policy measures that some countries have taken to isolate themselves. And this is clearly a risk to prosperity, at least that is a perspective that we take as the IMF. What I want to argue today here is the role of an institution like the IMF, I think, has become more important maybe today than it was before. The second point, I think, is that many of the problems that actually create some of the tensions today that create inequality, for example, can much easier be resolved if countries work together than if they work on their own. And an easy case of that is, for example, avoiding a race to the bottom in terms of income taxes, where countries compete to just offer lower taxes, and therefore government revenues decline, and therefore the ability of governments to invest in their people, to invest in education, to provide safety nets fall. If all countries work together on these issues, you can much easier resolve those problems. And the third issue, I think, is that many of the new challenges that we face, the challenges that the younger generations will really have to confront or that affect them mostly, they also require global solutions and global accords. I mean, think about climate change, for example. That is something that really requires coordination. An issue that's been quite prominently discussed here has to do with new technologies. We have suddenly new companies that have an incredibly dominant position. How do we tax them? How can we make sure that everybody gets a part of the pie? Data location. Countries have, of course, an interest to keep some of their data, but at the same time, pooling data also creates benefits. There are efficiencies there. All these issues have to be resolved at the global level, and therefore I think that we need, as I think Anoop Singh also said, referring to issues such as capital flow management, we need a strong international institutions that can bring the dialogue, can bring countries together, and can address these new challenges really for our future generations. Now, India is a growing economic power. It's the fastest growing major economy in the world, and by now already it accounts about 7% of global GDP by purchasing power calculations. And that weight that India has in the global economy will only rise with its young population. So India has a very important role to play, actually, in that multilateral order to make it work. So it has to assume its responsibilities going forward. And this brings me really to the second point. It brings me to the point of the IMF and India relationship. First of all, the IMF is at India's service. India is a member state of the IMF, as I said from the very beginning. And the IMF is an institution that was created to support its members. And the relationship, I think, between the IMF and India has reached a very mature state. At this point, of course, the lending function of the IMF is in the past, and that's for good. It shows really how the economy has grown and how it has improved. And so today, really, our main contribution that we make here is to provide capacity building, training and technical assistance to government officials, and also to provide policy advice to the authorities. Now, on the capacity building side, India has historically not been a very large user, but it took a decision a few years ago to support a technical assistance center here in New Delhi that was opened actually by the governor himself in his previous function here in New Delhi, and that covers not just India but also the rest of South Asia. And we are very excited about this center because it puts more resources into this part of the world, but this center does not just focus on the center, but also focus on the states. It provides training and assistance to the states, And for a country that has states, many of which would be among the largest members of the fund if they were independent, it makes a lot of sense to also support the states. So we see there really an ability or a potential to increase our interaction and to help India strengthen its human capital, not just at the central level but also at the subnational level. And this is an area where we look at much more cooperation going forward. And on the part of the policy advice and what we call surveillance, we really have a wide-ranging engagement in terms of the different actors we interact with and with whom we discuss policies. Surveillance is a bit like a candid dialogue among friends. You often agree, sometimes you disagree, but you disagree in good spirits, and I think this is how it should be. The IMF should be seen as a second pair of eyes, as a second opinion, as somebody who makes you think. But of course, at the same time, we also understand and we realize that the decisions on policy making always have to be and should be with the government and with the state, with the country, and this is how it and happens here in India as well. But the dialogue on policy issues is not a one-way street. Actually, we give our best advice, but we also do need the input from India, and I was quite heartened, and I think this is also one of the contributions of the book, to hear the governor today lay out a bit of vision of how we can address issues that are related to the international monetary system. And India, as a large economy, as an emerging market, really needs to bring its perspective and its experience to bear. The governor mentioned the integrated policy framework, which is a new initiative through which we will look at how we think about using different policy tools to manage these large capital flows that also Mr. Singh had mentioned, and how we can make them work really to the benefit of all countries. And there, I think, hopefully we can see India really stepping up and being active, and that requires, of course, the government to be active, but it requires also a debate of the civil society. It requires a debate of the thinkers of this country, to figure out, to lay out, how the international monetary and economic system can work for India. So congratulations for this book. I hope this is the start of a good discussion in this country. And of course, we at the IMF will be thrilled to participate in this discussion going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bauer. We wish you a bon voyage and all success in your new assignment. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, the governor of the Reserve Bank has to leave. He has a flight to catch. So we thank the Honorable Governor for his presence here today and for taking time off his busy schedule to join us. We will have question answers after this, so I hope all of you will stay on to continue the discussion. So we're ready for the question answer session. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, stand up, identify yourself, and go ahead and ask a question. Go ahead. He's coming around. Yes.
Question for Dr. Bauer. I heard that as the world gets more multipolar, cooperation, probably you meant in a pragmatic sense of the term, becomes more difficult. But in a unipolar world also, things can be disruptive because there are lots knocking at the gate to force themselves into the system of power. So can't it work both ways?
Any other questions? Mike, please. Please identify yourself. We'd be grateful.
Yeah, namaskar and congrats for the book. I'm Dr. Charu from IAPA, Indian Institute of Public Administration, working as an associate professor in e-governance and technology. I have a question which could be handled by any of them, and keeping in mind I'm a naive user of this technology. Our banks are very resilient, which we know in India. But our systems are still quite vulnerable. Like our financial sector has very high non-performing assets. And we have increasing level of interference and social instability. So how do we see the future of IMF as well as financial sector in future? Thank you.
We'll take one more question before we get the answers. Over there, please.
I have a question for Mr. Bauer. You know, what are your reactions to the cheap debt? You know, low interest rates that are being, right now, you know, that are very much, you know, that are the policy of the, advanced countries. Don't you feel that they are leading towards unproductive, you know, activities? For example, in overvaluation of tech majors, you know, tech monopolies and all, you know, and that is causing a lot of inequality into the system, you know, and that is going to be the major cause of the next financial crisis. You know. And that is also causing that is also the reason of a lot of debt, you know, as far as the governments are concerned.
Thank you. Would you like to answer it?
So, well, thanks for the questions. On the issue of multipolar versus unipolar, I'm certainly not suggesting that a unipolar world is the best environment. I think the advantage we have in a multipolar world is that we have the opportunity to come to a real consensus, and therefore we can have much broader ownership maybe that you can have in a unipolar situation. But at the same time, it requires much more coordination as well. It requires bringing everybody to the table and sorting out the different interests. So I was looking at it more from a practical perspective than from a normative perspective. The issue of cheap debt, of a low interest rate is indeed sometimes a little bit of a double-edged sword. On one side, low-cost finance can help mend balance sheets, especially in countries where you have, weaknesses in the corporate sector or in the banking sector. It can allow to make, high-yielding investments in human capital. But there are also risks. There are financial risks. There can be build-up of financial risks, and they have to be addressed. I think that is one of the major debates we have out there, to what extent or what instrument we use. There's a question about whether monetary policy has a role to play. We have brought in a new instrument, that are macroprudential policies. How can we use them to reduce financial risk? So I think this is pretty much an issue of concern, and it has to be addressed really in a holistic manner, both in terms of looking at issues of leverage, avoiding high leverage, and also avoiding high valuations in certain markets that can then lead to very disruptive adjustment. I think that is actually the core of our work, and we try through our surveillance to address these issues.
Anybody else would like to add anything? Okay, I'm sorry, there's no more time for questions now, and I'd like to request Mr. V. Srinivas to kind of give his closing remarks.
I'm extremely grateful to all the dignitaries for their insightful comments and the views that they have given. I would also like to thank some of the dignitaries who have come from far off to participate in this occasion. May I just mention the names, and I'll request the audience to put together a hand for them. May I introduce Shri Onkarlalji Dave. He's 82 years old. He has traveled all the way from Ajmer. He's the senior most advocate that we have in Rajasthan, and he was a man with whom I have served since I was a boy of 21 when I joined service. So I'm very grateful that you're here, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll also introduce Mr. Haldia has left. We served in 1993 together, and I'll introduce two of my secretaries in textiles, Mrs. Rita Menon from the 1975 batch at the IAS, and Madam Kiran Dhingda. She has traveled all the way from Goa for this event, and I'm very grateful to you, ma'am. I'm also like to introduce my family that is present. My wife Satya is here, and our two children. Please and she has braved health reasons, and still she's come and participated on this occasion. I'd also like to thank my colleagues who have come all the way from Ajmer, members on the Board of Revenue who have served with me, who currently serve in the Rajasthan High Court, and members on the Tax Board who have come, the senior advocates who in the Rajasthan Tax Bar and the Revenue Bar who have travelled all this way. There are people who have travelled all the way from Trivandrum, and Mr. Eapen is here. He's somewhere here, and he's travelled all the way from Trivandrum. People have come from Mumbai, Coimbatore, Calcutta, and I have Durumia Sahab, who's here, my former health minister in Rajasthan, and I'm grateful that he has come here. I'd also like to introduce Mr. Charandas Arha Sahab, 1967 batch of the IAS, who's been kind enough to come all the way from Hyderabad for this occasion. To conclude, I don't have much to say after the Honorable Governor has said and Dr. Anoop Singh has said. I do remember the fund my enduring movement of the fund of the 2002 post-globalization protests, and a large part of it had to go to Dr. Anoop Singh, who engineered the Argentina's ruthless conditionality setters. So today, when on this forum, Andreas speaks about climate change and gender issues and the soft issues of policy making, some of it doesn't go with the image of the IMF. You know, the IMF it's not that organization. In fact, when I wrote the book, Dr. Subbarao told me, "Oh, you've been so nice to the IMF; it's all sugar coated." And Mr. Eapen told me that, "Oh, you can be James Boughton too, and you can actually sugarcoat the fund so much." But the fund can be quite ruthless in terms of conditionality, and over a period of time, it has changed. And the Western world, as what Mr. Bauer has pointed out, wants the fund to predict crises in major countries and formulate technical papers and surveillance. And for smaller countries, it can be an institution, good institution for lending. However, in the world of financial globalization, a lender of last resort with about $360 billion is a small organization, and it will still have to look at raising more and more resources. And of course, as Dr. Montek has said, the fund's work on financial stability has to improve, and in terms of financial sector regulation, a lot more work has to be done. Well, India missed out on the first wave of globalization in the 70s and 80s, when many countries, especially those in Asia, opened up and prospered on the back of exporting to the rich world. We should not miss out again, and for India to benefit from globalization, we need a global regime of trade and financial flows that's free, fair, and equitable. And it is the responsibility of the IMF to ensure that. Despite all the criticism that it gets, the IMF is a highly credible institution, and its voice is heard and heeded. Once again, I'm extremely grateful to each and every one of you, my personal gratitude, and thank you very much. I've grown up with you, and I'm happy that many of you are here on this occasion.
Finally, a vote of thanks by Dr. Nivedita Ray, Director Research, ICWA.
Thank you. Dignitaries in the dais, excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon. On behalf of ICWA, it is my pleasure to propose the vote of thanks at this occasion. At the outset, I would like to place on record our deep gratitude to Shri Shaktikanta, Governor, Reserve Bank of India, for gracing us with his presence and for his very interesting and thought-provoking address on the IMF and its role in the international monetary system. We are very grateful to the esteemed panelists, Shri K.V. Eapen, Secretary, Department of Administrative Reforms and Public Grievances, Dr. Anoop Singh, Member, 15th Finance Commission of India, and Dr. Andreas Bauer, Senior Resident Representative IMF, for their very insightful remarks on the book and also on the broader reflections on the subject. I would also like to thank Srimati Sukanya Balakrishnan for moderating the session. I also take this opportunity to extend our special thanks to the author, Shri V. Srinivas, for not only writing this book on a very important and a very relevant subject, but for sharing his thoughts on this book today and highlighting us on the findings about his book and also enriching us with his thoughts on the subject. I would also like to thank Dr. T.C.A. Raghavan, DG ICWA, for his introductory remarks. Our special gratitude to all the distinguished guests in the audience for your valuable participation today. I would now request everyone to join us in the foyer for a high tea. Thank you.